The year is 197 AD. In the ancient city of Carthage, a young mother sits in a dark prison cell, her infant son crying in her arms. Tomorrow she will be dragged into the amphitheater and torn apart by wild beasts while thousands cheer. Her crime? Refusing to denounce her faith. Her name is Perpetua, and she's 22 years old. But here's what history almost forgot. She didn't just die for Christianity. She wrote one of the earliest Christian texts we have, penned in her own hand from that very prison cell, making her one of the first Christian authors whose words survive to this day. And she wasn't alone. For every story like Perpetua's that barely survived, dozens more were deliberately erased, rewritten, or attributed to men. We've been taught that the early church was built by the apostles, by Paul, by Peter, by the church fathers, by bishops and theologians whose beards grew as long as their theological treatises. But what if I told you that's only half the story? What if the foundation of Christianity was actually laid by an army of women whose names were systematically scrubbed from history? Welcome to Professor Archive, where we unearth the stories they don't want you to know. Today, we're diving into one of history's greatest cover-ups, not through conspiracy, but through something far more insidious. Selective memory. This is the story of the women who shaped Christianity, and the men who spent centuries making sure you'd never hear about them. Let's start with something that should shock you, but probably won't because you've never heard it before. In the earliest Christian communities, women weren't sitting quietly in the back. They were running the show. We know this not from feminist revisionist history, but from the mouths of Christianity's harshest critics at the time. Celsus, a 2nd century Roman philosopher who absolutely despised Christianity, complained bitterly that the religion attracted women, slaves, and children, and that its leaders were often uneducated women working in wool shops and homes, teaching anyone who would listen. He meant it as an insult, but inadvertently he preserved a truth that later Christians would spend centuries trying to bury. The Apostle Paul, often painted as Christianity's greatest misogynist, actually gives us our first evidence. In his letter to the Romans, written around 57 AD, he sends greetings to a woman named Junia, whom he calls prominent among the apostles. Read that again. A female apostle. For 16 centuries, this was in the Bible. Then, around the 13th century, something strange started happening in translations. Junia became Junias, a man's name. Modern scholars have searched extensively for any evidence that Junius was ever a male name in ancient Rome. They've found none. It didn't exist. Scribes literally changed her gender because they couldn't accept that Paul had acknowledged a female apostle. But Junia wasn't alone in that letter. Paul mentions 29 people by name in Romans chapter 16. 10 of them are women. He calls Phoebe a deacon of the church at Centuriae, the same title he uses for himself and other male church leaders. He describes Prisca alongside her husband Aquila, but notably mentions her name first 4 out of 6 times, suggesting she was the more prominent teacher. He mentions Mary, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and Persis as women who have worked very hard in the Lord, using the exact same Greek word he uses to describe his own apostolic labor elsewhere. Here's where it gets fascinating. In 2010, archaeologists working in the catacombs of Rome made a discovery that sent shockwaves through academic circles. They found a 4th century fresco clearly depicting a woman in bishop's vestments, raising her hands in the traditional gesture of blessing. Above her head was an inscription, Episcopa Theodora, Bishop Theodora. But there's a problem. Someone, at some point in history, had tried to erase her. The word episcopa had been carefully scratched at, an attempt to make it illegible. They failed because they used cheap tools and the catacomb's humidity preserved the indentation. Before we go further, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it right now? Are you a student diving into church history? A theologian questioning what you were taught? Or maybe just someone who stumbled onto this at 3 in the morning going down a YouTube rabbit hole? Drop a comment. I read every single one, and your stories from around the globe honestly make this channel what it is. Now, let's talk about Mary Magdalene, because almost everything you think you know about her is wrong. She wasn't a prostitute. That's a myth that began with Pope Gregory the Great in 591 AD when he conflated her with two other women in the Bible, neither of whom is actually identified as Mary Magdalene. The Orthodox Church never made this mistake, by the way. Only the West did. So why did Gregory do it? Perhaps because the real Mary Magdalene was far too powerful a figure to leave unsullied. In the canonical Gospels, Mary Magdalene appears more than most of the male apostles. She's present at the crucifixion when most of the men fled. She's the first witness to the resurrection. In fact, in all four Gospels, she's the one who brings the news to the male disciples. Early Christians called her the apostle to the apostles. Think about the title. It means the apostles themselves learned about the risen Christ from a woman. This was so problematic for later church fathers that they had to explain it away. Tertullian, writing in the early 3rd century, says women shouldn't teach or baptize, then has to awkwardly admit that Jesus appeared first to women, which he explains as Jesus honoring Eve through her daughters. The gymnastics required to maintain patriarchal order while accounting for the biblical text are truly impressive. But here's what will really bake your noodle. In 1896, a German scholar named Karl Reinhardt purchased an ancient papyrus codex in Cairo. It contained something explosive, the Gospel of Mary, dated to the 2nd century. In this text, Mary Magdalene receives secret teachings from Jesus and shares them with the other disciples. Peter gets angry, asking, "Did he really speak with a woman in private without our knowledge?" Levi responds, "Peter, you have always been hot-tempered. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her?" This wasn't some fringe document. It was widely copied and translated into multiple languages, but it didn't make the biblical canon. Why? The cynical answer is sexism. The more nuanced answer is also sexism, but with extra steps. As Christianity moved from a persecuted underground movement to the official religion of Rome, it needed to interface with Roman power structures, which were thoroughly patriarchal. Women leading churches was fine when Christians were meeting in secret in people's homes. It was not fine when the emperor was watching. Let's return to Perpetua because her story deserves more than the opening mention. Vibia Perpetua was a noblewoman with education, which was rare for women at the time. When she was arrested along with several other Christians, she kept a diary. This diary, The Passion of Saints Perpetua and Felicity, is one of the oldest surviving Christian texts written by a woman. In fact, it's one of the oldest surviving pieces of literature written by a woman in Latin period. The entries are visceral. She writes about her father begging her to recant, holding her baby son, trying to convince her to save herself. She refuses. She describes theological visions with stunning detail. At one point, she dreams she's fighting an Egyptian gladiator. But in the dream, she becomes male to do so. Modern scholars debate what this means, but one thing is clear. Perpetua understood that masculinity equaled power, even in her subconscious. Here's the kicker. Later, editors added a prologue and epilogue to her diary, written by a male narrator who frames her story. Some scholars believe this was Tertullian himself, the same church father who insisted women should be silent. He needed her story, her martyrdom, because it was powerful and inspiring. But he couldn't let it stand alone in her voice. He had to wrap it in male authority. Perpetua was executed in 203 AD. Her story became one of the most popular martyrdom accounts in early Christianity. Augustine of Hippo preached about her. She was venerated as a saint. But as the centuries passed, something changed. Her diary was read less and less. The male written frame became the focus. By the medieval period, most Christians knew she died for the faith but had never read her actual words. Then there's Thecla. If you've never heard of her, you're not alone, which is bizarre because for the first few centuries of Christianity, she was more popular than most of the apostles. The Acts of Paul and Thecla, written in the mid-2nd century, tells the story of a young woman who hears Paul preach, abandons her engagement to embrace celibacy, and becomes an itinerant preacher and baptizer. The text explicitly shows her baptizing herself when no one else will do it, then baptizing others. This text was wildly popular. Churches were dedicated to St. Thecla all over the Mediterranean. Her shrine in Seleucia became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in early Christianity. Tertullian, our friend who keeps popping up, actually complained that people were using the Acts of Thecla to justify women teaching and baptizing. He claimed the text was a forgery written by a presbyter who was caught and defrocked, though conveniently no other source confirms this story. What's fascinating is that whether the Acts of Thecla is historical or fictional, its popularity tells us something crucial. Early Christians had no problem with stories of women as preachers, teachers, and baptizers. These weren't scandalous ideas. They were celebrated ones. The scandal came later. Scandal, us. Archaeological evidence backs this up in ways that are hard to ignore. Throughout the Mediterranean, we find inscriptions and frescoes in early Christian sites showing women in leadership roles. In the Santa Prassede catacomb in Rome, there's a 4th century fresco of 4 women at a funeral banquet, one of whom is clearly presiding over the Eucharist. In the ancient church of St. Pudenziana, a mosaic shows women among the apostles. In Salona, Croatia, an inscription reads, Flavia Vitalia, most devoted handmaid of God, who lived 68 years and served as a presbyter for 41 years. A presbyter is a priest, a female priest. The inscription is from the 4th century, not the 1st. This wasn't just an early quirk that died out. Women remained in church leadership for centuries. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. In 431 AD, the Council of Ephesus made a decision that would echo through history. They declared Mary, the mother of Jesus, to be Theotokos, the God-bearer, elevating her to an unprecedented level of veneration. On the surface, this seems like honoring a woman, but look closer. What kind of woman were they honoring? A virgin mother, silent, submissive, whose greatest virtue was saying yes to God's plan, and whose most famous words are, "Let it be done unto me according to your word." This became the template. Women could be venerated for virginity, martyrdom, and submission, but women like Junia the apostle, Phoebe the deacon, Theodora the bishop, they became inconvenient. Their stories didn't fit the emerging narrative of what Christian womanhood should look like. If you're finding this fascinating, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you've really been enjoying what we do here at Professor Archive, uncovering the stories that got buried, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. It genuinely helps us keep digging into archives and accessing the historical sources that make these videos possible. Now, let's keep going because the cover-up gets even more elaborate. By the 6th century, the transformation was nearly complete. The Council of Laodicea officially prohibited women from being ordained to any church office. The Second Council of Orleans in 533 decreed that women could no longer receive communion directly into their hands because they were considered unclean, echoing ancient purity codes that Christianity had supposedly moved beyond. In 585, the Council of Macon literally debated whether women had souls. The motion that they did barely passed. Let that sink in. Barely 5 centuries after Mary Magdalene was the first witness to the resurrection, church officials were debating whether women were fully human. But women didn't just disappear quietly into the margins. They fought back, though their resistance took forms that history often misunderstands. The rise of monasticism in the 4th and 5th centuries was, in many ways, a form of female resistance. By becoming nuns, women could escape arranged marriages, gain literacy, own property collectively, and create communities governed by women. Take Melania the Younger, born in 383 to one of the richest families in Rome. At 14, she was married to Pinianus, also from a wealthy family. But Melania wanted something different. She convinced her husband to join her in a life of asceticism. They freed 8,000 slaves, sold their vast estates, and founded monasteries. Melania herself traveled to Egypt, Palestine, and across the Mediterranean, teaching and debating theology with the greatest minds of her age. Jerome, one of the most influential church fathers, translated the Bible into Latin, at her urging, and dedicated several of his works to her. Or consider Egeria, a 4th century nun who traveled from Spain to Jerusalem, Egypt, and throughout the Holy Land. She wrote detailed accounts of her journeys, describing liturgical practices and sacred sites. Her writings became a crucial source for understanding early Christian worship. She met with bishops and abbots as an equal, discussing theology and scripture. Then there's Macrina the Younger, sister of two famous church fathers, Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nyssa. When their father died, Macrina turned the family estate into a monastery and became its leader. Her younger brother Gregory later wrote that she was his theological teacher, that her insights shaped his understanding of the resurrection and the soul. Yet in the standard histories of Christian theology, Basil and Gregory are household names. Macrina is a footnote. This pattern repeats constantly. Brilliant women whose brothers or sons became famous, but whose own contributions were attributed to male relatives or forgotten entirely. It's not unlike the way Rosalind Franklin's work on DNA structure was overshadowed by Watson and Crick, or how Lise Meitner's contribution to nuclear fission was credited to Otto Hahn, except this has been happening for 2,000 years. In medieval Europe, the pattern continued with women like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who composed music, wrote theological treatises, practiced medicine, and corresponded with popes and emperors. She had visions that she claimed were divine revelation. Had she been a man, she would be remembered alongside Thomas Aquinas and Augustine as one of the great theological minds of Christianity. Instead, she's known primarily as a medieval mystic, as if her visions were charming eccentricities, rather than the theological statements she intended them to be. Julian of Norwich, a 14th century English mystic, wrote the first book in English by a woman. Revelations of Divine Love is a sophisticated theological work exploring the nature of God's love, using maternal imagery for Christ decades before anyone else dared. She referred to Jesus as mother, writing about how he feeds us with his body, just as a mother nurses a child. This was radical theology. It still is. But most Christians have never heard of her. The Protestant Reformation promised a return to biblical Christianity, stripping away centuries of Catholic tradition. Surely this would restore women to their biblical roles, right? Not exactly. Martin Luther did encourage women's literacy so they could read the Bible, but he also wrote that women should remain silent in church and that their greatest calling was producing children. He praised childbirth as women's martyrdom, as if dying in labor was equivalent to Perpetua facing the beast for her faith. John Calvin was even more restrictive, arguing that women's subordination to men was part of the created order, not just a consequence of the fall. This meant that even in the paradise of Eden, before sin entered the world, women were meant to be subject to men. It was theological cement poured over any possibility of female equality. But women still found ways. The Anabaptist movement, radical reformers considered heretics by Catholics and mainstream Protestants alike, allowed women to preach and prophesy. Women like Ursula Jost and Barbara Rebstock had their prophecies recorded and circulated, influencing theology and practice. The Quakers, founded in the 17th century, allowed women to speak in meetings from the very beginning. Margaret Fell, considered the mother of Quakerism, wrote a treatise in 1666 titled Women's Speaking Justified that systematically refuted biblical arguments against women's preaching. In America, the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century saw women taking leadership roles in revival meetings. Phoebe Palmer, a Methodist evangelist, held revival meetings throughout the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, preaching to thousands. She published works on theology and holiness that influenced the entire holiness movement, but she always had to justify her preaching, writing lengthy defenses of why God had called her to speak publicly despite being a woman. This is exhausting, isn't it? Centuries of brilliant women having to justify their existence, their voices, their callings. Having to prove that God could possibly use them despite the unfortunate accident of their gender. Here's what gets me. We have the receipts. The evidence of women's leadership in early Christianity isn't hidden in obscure archives, it's in the Bible. It's in Paul's letters, it's in archaeological sites, it's in the writings of church fathers complaining about women's roles, inadvertently preserving evidence of their leadership while arguing against it. The erasure required active effort. It required translating Junia as Junias. It required declaring texts like the Gospel of Mary heretical. It required defacing frescoes and catacombs. It required councils and decrees and theological treatises explaining why the biblical evidence of women's leadership should be ignored. In 1980, a retired farmer in Egypt decided to finally reveal a secret his family had been keeping for decades. In 1945, his brother had been digging for fertilizer near Nag Hammadi when he found a sealed jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 texts, including multiple Gospels, Acts, and Apocalypses that had been lost for over 1,500 years. Among them were texts that featured women prominently: the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Thunder, Perfect Mind. These weren't forgeries or late compositions. Dating analysis showed they were copied in the 4th century, but the texts themselves dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, contemporary with or even earlier than some books that made it into the New Testament. The Gospel of Philip contains a passage that's been endlessly debated. Jesus kissed Mary Magdalene often, and the male disciples became jealous. The Coptic word that's partially damaged in the manuscript has been reconstructed as mouth, though some argue it could be forehead or hand. But focus on what's not in question. The disciples were jealous of Jesus' closeness with Mary. This echoes what we see in the Gospel of Mary, where Peter challenges her authority. What these texts reveal is that in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there was a diversity of Christian thought about gender, about leadership, about authority. Some communities venerated Mary Magdalene as the greatest apostle. Some told stories of female apostles and teachers. When orthodoxy was established and the biblical canon closed, these texts were suppressed. Not because they were late or unreliable, but because they represented the losing side of a theological battle. The women were on the losing side. Let me bring this back to where we started, to Perpetua in her prison cell. She had every reason to recant. She was young, wealthy, educated. She had a newborn son. Her father, who loved her desperately, begged her to save herself. One word, one gesture to the Roman gods, and she could go home. But she chose differently. And in that cell, she wrote. She claimed her voice. She told her own story. That diary survived because her martyrdom made her too important to erase entirely. But how many other women wrote things that didn't survive? How many prophesied in churches that didn't record their words? How many taught and healed and led communities whose stories were never written down, or were written down and then lost, or were written down and preserved but attributed to men? We'll never know the full extent of what was lost. But we know enough to say with certainty that the story of early Christianity has been told with half its characters missing. Imagine trying to understand the plot of a movie when every scene with female characters has been cut. You'd get the general idea, but you'd miss crucial context, motivation, relationships, and meaning. That's what we've been doing with Christian history. We've been watching a version with half the cast edited out, and we've called that the full story. The good news is that scholarship in the last 50 years has been reconstructing what was erased. Feminist theologians, historians, and archaeologists have been piecing together the forgotten women of the early church. They're retranslating ancient texts, re-examining archaeological evidence, and reading the church fathers against the grain, finding evidence of women's leadership in the very texts that argued against it. This isn't about revising history to fit modern sensibilities. This is about uncovering the history that was deliberately obscured. This is about recognizing that when Paul greeted Junia the apostle, Phoebe the deacon, and Priscilla the teacher, he wasn't being radical or progressive. He was simply acknowledging the reality of his churches. The women were there from the beginning, at the crucifixion, at the resurrection, in the upper room at Pentecost, in the house churches that formed the backbone of early Christianity, teaching, prophesying, leading, writing, and dying for their faith. They were there. And then, slowly, systematically, their names were erased, their titles changed, their words attributed to men, their bodies pushed to the margins, and their voices silenced. But here's the thing about truth. It has a way of resurfacing. You can scratch out an inscription, but the indentation remains. You can change a name in translation, but the original language doesn't lie. You can exclude texts from the canon, but you can't destroy every copy if they've already spread across the ancient world. The forgotten women of the early church are being remembered. Junia is being called an apostle again. Phoebe is being recognized as a deacon. Perpetua's voice is being heard in her own words. Thecla's story is being told. The Episcopal Theater's image is being studied. The female presbyters and bishops whose names appear on inscriptions are being acknowledged. This matters. It matters because history shapes the present. The erasure of women from early church history has been used for 2,000 years to justify excluding women from leadership. If there were no female apostles, no female deacons, no female presbyters, then women today can be told they're asking for something unprecedented, something contrary to Christian tradition. But if the truth is that women were there from the beginning, leading and teaching and shaping the faith, then their exclusion is the innovation. Silencing them is the break from tradition. The forgotten women of the early church are not some niche academic concern. They're evidence that the Christianity we know, the hierarchies we accept as ancient and unchangeable, are actually the product of historical forces, political decisions, and yes, patriarchal bias. This has been Professor Archive. If you made it this far, you're clearly someone who cares about the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. Keep questioning, keep digging, keep remembering the forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, we can tell a fuller story, one that includes all the voices that built this faith, not just the ones we were told to listen to.